Hello and welcome to Rewildology, the show that explores conservation, travel, and rewilding the planet. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell-Norman, conservation biologist and adventure traveler. Oh, welcome back, everyone. I'm so insanely excited to be relaunching the show, and I promise it's going to be bigger and better than before. However, I don't want to waste any time getting to today's fantastic episode, and so be sure to stay tuned until after the interview with today's guests to hear the long list of exciting updates that we tackled while the show's offline for the month of August. It's summertime here in the Northern Hemisphere, and you or someone you know probably took a beach vacation to an island off the coast of somewhere beautiful. To quote the little-known country star named Kenny Chesney. We daydream about islands, travel to islands, write songs about islands, and hope and pray to one day live on an island. Although islands only account for about 5% of the Earth's total landmass, they are some of the most biodiverse regions on the planet and are home to about 40% of all threatened vertebrate species. In addition, about 61% of the Earth's extinction events since the 1500s have occurred on islands. This begs the question, what is going on with our incredibly biodiverse islands? Why are they having such a hard time? And most importantly, how do we halt and eventually reverse the damage that's been caused over the past 700 years? To teach us all about conserving and restoring our islands, today we're sitting down with Dena Spatz, PhD, David Will, and Nick Holmes, PhD, the three leading scientists on the historic paper that was just released called The Global Contribution of Invasive Vertebrate Eradication as a Key Island Restoration Tool. In this massively important paper, these scientists synthesized over 100 years of invasive vertebrate eradications from islands and found that this type of intervention had an 88% success rate. Yes, an 88% success rate. It's rare that anything in conservation can give such a clear path forward. Dena, Dave, Nick, and I chat about a wide range of topics, including the history behind our island's decline, what's all involved in island conservation interventions, including eradications and restoration, how they created the novel database that's at the center of their historic paper, how to prevent future invasions from opportunistic species, and how we all can help save our islands. All right, friends, without further ado, here is my conversation with Dena, Dave, and Nick. Well, hi, Dave, Nick, and Dena. Thank you all so much for coming on the Rewildology podcast and exploring this insanely important topic with me that I cannot wait to dive really deep in. But first, you're brand new to the community. Please, let's start diving into each of your stories and exploring why you do what you do. So, Dena, let's start with you. Could you take us through your story and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. I'm Dena Spatz. I am a senior conservation scientist for a nonprofit called Pacific Rim Conservation. They're based in Oahu, Hawaii, although I'm in Sacramento, California. And I'm the lead author of the paper that we're talking about today about invasive species and eradications. But I guess my journey to here wasn't really direct. I didn't intend to work on invasive species issues per se. I think I got very lucky in college or after college. I had a really awesome professor who was sort of helping me find my way. I knew I was interested in nature and science and conservation, but what exactly was the question? And so as I was looking for, my path, he introduced me to the Friday Harbor Labs, this research apprenticeship up in the San Juan Islands of Washington. And so he said, why don't you go up there and see what you discover, really? So I went there. I was a research apprentice, and I was exposed to this amazing coastal marine environment just off the San Juans. And we were looking at, plankton and oceanography and seabirds. And that is where I eventually found my passion. I was on these research vessels monitoring seabirds, and I watched MERS diving underwater and then flying into the air. And I just thought, oh my gosh, these are really incredible creatures. I want to learn more. So, after doing this program, I looked into, jobs working with seabirds, essentially birds that, use the marine environment, but also like require land to breed, these really weird groups of animals. And so just over time, I took different jobs working with these birds and learning more and more about them and their natural history. And of course, once you start diving into a certain group of animals, you start learning about their conservation status. And so I learned over time, seabirds are this super cool, highly adaptive kind of bird, but they're really, really endangered. They're one of the most endangered birds on the planet. Bird groups on the planet. And so I decided I wanted to go back to grad school just to become a conservation scientist, essentially. And by doing that, I got introduced to islands, really. And once you get introduced to islands and you're thinking about seabirds, it's very obvious what's starting to drive their extinction rates, and that's invasive species. And I know we're going to get deep into what they are and what we're doing to resolve this issue of invasive species on islands, but that's kind of the trajectory that took me there.
Oh, that's a great story. It's just, I love exploring and how do these pieces fit together? How did you get to this paper being the first author on it? So then let's shift gears. Dave, what is your story? How did you get to today and this work you're doing now?
Yeah, thanks, Brooke. Thanks for having me. I'm Dave Will with Island Conservation. Island Conservation is the global nonprofit that's focused on preventing extinctions on islands by removing invasive species. I've been with Island Conservation about 15 years now, and currently our head of innovation. And much like Dena, I came to this not knowing much of anything about islands or about invasive species. I've been involved now in probably more than 100 different interventions on islands. And before I started all this 15 years ago, I could have not put any of those places on a map. If you asked me where any of these islands were, I didn't even know they existed. And I also went to UC Santa Cruz for my undergraduate and kind of came from a bioinformatics background, so computer science and biology. And as I was going through my undergraduate, a lot of that was very focused on molecular biology, which was interesting, but I had a real passion of having grown up outside and work in nature a lot, of real passion about conservation. And so I was looking for ways to apply kind of computer science and those sorts of things to ecological problems. And I happened to get an internship with Island Conservation, kind of my last quarter at UC Santa Cruz, just using Google Earth to explore how can we communicate about how can Island Conservation communicate about islands and share the work that they're doing. And through that and working with the staff there, I think I just had a really unique skill set in databases and programming that was really fortuitous, and that there was a couple of projects that needed some skills on the ground to be able to develop mobile applications and tools to be able to collect information about how those eradications and interventions were happening. And so I just happened to be at the right spot at the right time and was fortunate to go out to Isla de la Plata. It was my first project out in Ecuador, protecting some seabird colonies out there, blue-footed boobies and other seabirds. And it was a really impactful experience for me to be out on those islands and spending several, I think we were there for a month or 2 months out on the island every day, interacting with the island and getting to experience the seabirds. I remember clearly there was one bird in particular at the top of the island. There was kind of a gazebo shade structure that we would stop after hiking every day. And there was one masked booby that hadn't learned to fly yet. And they would come over every morning and tap on my boots and kind of, nibble on my toes and say hello. And I named it Goggles because it had this kind of over it. And I got to experience the first time it flew. I was there long enough that every day it would come up and say hello. And then one day it decided to jump off the edge of the cliff and fly for the first time. And that was just one of the many impactful experiences of being out on these islands and being there long enough to be able to understand these island ecosystems and the kind of impacts that you can have by addressing the problem of invasive species. And I felt lucky to have been here for 15 years. And my role now is kind of how can we increase the efficiency of these interventions, increase the scale, the scope, and the pace, and looking at a whole different variety of methods to doing that. And I come at this particular topic and paper from a couple of different backgrounds of having been involved in interventions, but also helping build the database to be able to track that, and excited to tell that story. So again, thanks for having me.
Did you tear up when that bird flew away? I would have cried. Okay. I would have cried so hard.
Yeah, and it's one of I have a 4-year-old son, and it's one of my favorite stories to tell him. And he keeps asking me if can I go meet Goggles someday, and I'm like, yes, someday we'll help you. We'll figure out a way. You can't meet Goggles specifically, but we'll figure out a way for you to meet someone like him.
That kind of makes me want to cry. That's like so, that's just beautiful. Just even sharing these amazing experiences with your children and like watching it develop in them. And like, yes, we will go see Goggles or their descendants, which is even more exciting. Oh, that's gorgeous. So Nick, it's your turn. Please share your story with us as well.
Hey, Brooke. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Nick Holmes. I'm the Associate Director for the Oceans Program for the Nature Conservancy here in California. And my story is not that different from Dena and Dave. It's just, as a kid, seeing places that sort of triggered something, reading National Geographic at Grandma and Grandpa's house, seeing these images and realizing that the islands were a place that I'd like to go and see. And then sort of during my undergraduate years, I studied park management in Australia, and there were opportunities to get to some of these places. And some of them were like Montague Island off the southeast coast of New South Wales, and then later Macquarie Island in the subantarctic. And getting to these places, and you could see that they really belong to the plants and the animals in a way that you don't see in a lot of other places in our modern world. And so to be in amongst more seabirds, in this case I studied penguins for a long time, and so to be in amongst sort of a cacophony of sound and smell and colour as these colonial seabirds, because if there's one there's usually hundreds, and to see what really how that part of the world operated. And so it kind of gets under your skin, it sets off a spark, and you really like, oh wow, this is pretty special, and you kind of realise this is a rare moment, and you get to see something as it should be, if you like. And for me, there were lots and lots of moments on islands where sitting amongst elephant seals or sitting amongst king penguins and being cold or being hungry, but realizing that this was a special place. And so you kind of get addicted to that. And these special places, you're like, okay, well, there's other special places as well. There's other islands around the world. And for me, I did my doctorate at the University of Tasmania, and by that time, I had met my future wife, a beautiful, remarkable, very tolerant American, and we moved to Hawaii. Mm-hmm. And so in Hawaii, I started running a recovery program for some threatened seabirds, birds that feed at sea but bred up in the mountains. They were burrowing petrels and really remarkable birds. And so I spent a lot of time looking for these things. They were rare enough in the landscape that management didn't really know where all of them were or how to combat the threats. And when you start being on islands long enough, the threats start to become particularly evident. And they're quite common. That one of the most dominant threats around the world are invasive species, particularly invasive mammals. And they've been brought there sort of accidentally or deliberately. And so when you start working on islands and you start opening yourself up to these island stories, these island narratives, inevitably one of the characters becomes invasive species. They're either there and something needs to be done about it if we want to see benefit, or they're a risk and we want to prevent them from getting there. And so for me, this story of needing to see places and experience parts of the world really brought about career opportunities. I found myself really fortunate to have had that and to have a tolerant wife that's let me do those things. And now I'm here in California, and I am really fortunate to work with people like Dave and with Dena and so many other people in the island community. As islands typically evoke quite small landscapes in most people's minds. However, there really is a global community. And so I feel really lucky to have connected to people from Portugal, from Spain, from South Africa, you name it. There's islands all around the world, and there are consistent challenges and opportunities that these places bring. And so for us, this paper is also a celebration of that. It's a celebration of what happens on a small island, but at a global scale. And so it was really, really cool to be able to put that all together and to share it with you today. So thank you.
Yes. And you started to drop a little hint about what is actually going on with our islands. And I know that all three of you have seen this firsthand, but could you, maybe for someone who might not know exactly what's going on, or I'm not an island expert by any means, most of what I've studied has been on actual like landscapes on a terrestrial land. So could you maybe give us more information? Why are our islands having such a hard time?
Wow. Well, let's start with a little bit of ecology, life history, natural history. And so islands are remote places. You think about Hawaii, think about French Polynesia, think about the Azores. These are places that are quite remote. And as a consequence of that, the natural history, the evolution of species in these places, these places, has been very different. There's a remarkably high endemism on islands. And when you look at plant endemism and you look at vertebrate endemism, the richness on islands is about 10 times greater than what you see on the mainland.
Wow.
And it's because of that, these evolutionary processes where ancestors or something has come and brought a founding population, where whether it's a seed or whether it's a bird, and it's allowed new species, they take hold, and it allows new species to evolve and adapt and radiate. And some classic examples are, of course, the Galapagos with finches, but also if you go to Hawaii, for example, there were 50 Hawaiian honeycreepers. A honeycreeper is a small bird that they've evolved in this beautiful marriage with plants, where they pollinate different plants, and their bills and their beaks have evolved to the shapes of the flowers, lobeliads and things like this. They all evolved from a single species ancestor, probably a Cardoine finch, that somehow got there, maybe by storm or maybe by strong winds. Some event allowed it to get there and to take hold. And then this radiation occurs. And now we have species that occur nowhere else in the world. And the other part that happens with islands, if you think about this, it kind of makes sense. If you go to a place like New Zealand, for example, there are no native land mammals. The exceptions are bats, and of course bats can fly, and seals, excellent swimmers. So you can see how they got to places like this. And so when you go to a lot of islands, there's an absence of mammalian life history. And that's exactly what happened in New Zealand, in Hawaii, in many archipelagos around the world. And so it's the absence of these mammals and some of the traits, so predators, for example. Herbivory was taken over by birds. So when you go to Hawaii, there used to be 6 ducks and geese, and they serve the roles of lots of other mammals that you see on the mainland. They move soil, they transport seeds, they do all these kinds of things, but they're birds, they're not mammals. There were no bobcats, mountain lions, there were no birds of prey for many of these places. And so when these mammals arrived, and that was inevitable when these mammals arrived, so cast yourself back to the times of ancient sailing ships and the British and the French and the Spaniards, they're expanding their range, they're exploring new worlds, they're doing things. With them, they brought unintentional and deliberate visitors to the islands. Rats were amongst some of the first to think about. Rats are estimated to be on about 80% of the world's archipelagos.
Wow.
When rats arrived and when goats arrived, goats were often a deliberate introduction. Goats are often thought of as like an insurance strategy. If I get shipwrecked, there's a goat. I can eat it, I can milk it, if I'm crafty, I can make myself a lovely cardigan or something like that. Goats are an insurance strategy. Lots of plants, equivalent things. When you look around the Pacific, you'll see a lot of Cook and Norfolk pines. They were actually insurance masts in case the wooden ships lost a mast at sea. So therein began this age of transfer, and then it stepped up a notch when we started to have an increase in shipping traffic. And in our modern world, advents like the shipping container and modern shipping traffic has sort of transformed the ability to intentionally and unintentionally move things around the planet. Ants today, for example, so fire ants, crazy ants, there's a number of tramp ants that are particularly damaging, not just to plants and animals, but also to humans and our livelihoods, agriculture and things like this. And so Invasives have been one of the driving factors of declines, extinctions, extirpations. So extirpation is to lose a population from an island, but it's not yet extinct. That has been a major feature of islands. And so it's no surprise that when you look at extinction rates and endangerment rates, islands are only about 5% of our total landmass on the planet. So you take all the islands, put them in a bucket. In that bucket, about 5% are islands. That 5% has been home to about between 60 and 80% of our world's extinctions today. So since about the 1500s. So think about that age of sailing and things like this. And when we look at our IUCN Red List, sort of the global yardstick of what's closest to extinction, about 40% of our most threatened species are on islands. So 5% of the land, but all of this extinction and endangerment, there's a much higher rate of extinction and endangerment on islands. And it's because of this endemism. Our 6 geese out on Hawaii, there's only one left, the nene.
Wow.
And the nene is beautiful because it's it's a lazy Canadian goose that came to Hawaii and then a part of that population that never went back and just evolved into what it is today. It's a lovely metaphor. And this, no offense to Canadians, I have Canadian heritage. But we lost these geese, and we lost all sorts of really remarkable and rare endemic plants and animals all around the world because of these introductions. They could not compete with these new species that arrived because they evolved in the absence of them. They had no instinct or physiological response that allowed them to either fight or flight. They just sat there, and that's how we lost them. And so that rarity led to an increased vulnerability when these invasive species arrived. That's a long-winded answer, but there's some
No,
things
that was great. No, that was fantastic. No, thank you, because you were able to take us through the whole history and everything, which brings us up to now. And Dena, I would like to shift to you for a second. So seeing that you are the first author on this paper that we're discussing today, I would love if you could give a synopsis of what you 3 did and discovered, because what's so exciting and why I was so pumped to have the opportunity to talk to you 3, because you offer a solution, and it is so rare in our field to have something that we can look towards as almost like a North Star, as a guiding light. And you 3 found that. So please, Dena, could you just explain the things? What did you 3 do?
Yeah, sure. Well, Nick gave this amazing backstory, and it's that story about islands and history and human, movement around the world, invasive species, that, a large group of people actually came together and said, okay, like, we have this huge problem. And what can we do about it? And it wasn't just Nick and Dave and I. There's a lot of precedent before us. And so, we actually worked with UC Santa Cruz. We worked with folks in New Zealand, IUCN Invasive Species Specialist Group, people from all these different places that recognize this really bad problem, came together and said, well, what can we do to resolve this? And that, eventually we worked together to write this paper. But even before that, people on islands recognized that there was this, absence of diversity, that things were starting to go extinct, and started removing invasive species from islands, just doing it and seeing quickly that, if we take goats off of an island, then a lot of the native plants come back. If you take rats off of an island, you start seeing these amazing quick responses. And so, this just sort of started happening because people on islands recognized that there was a problem. And so we call this invasive species eradications, more technically today. And so this group that I mentioned, they said, we came together and we said, well, how long has this been happening for? We know that there are benefits from removing invasive species from islands because of many times of this happening over and over again. We've been taking, especially invasive mammals, like Nick mentioned, are one of the most prolific kinds of invasive species on islands and the most damaging. And we see when you take them off, things respond really, really well. You see really quick benefits. So knowing that, we wanted to just ask simple questions like, okay, like, where has this been done before, and how many times, and for how long? And so with those simple questions, we basically built a database of island invasive species eradications. It's kind of a mouthful. We call it the DICE. where we looked towards global experts. We sent out hundreds of emails to people around the world and said, hey, have you done this? Have you removed invasive species from islands? And if so, can you tell us about that? We went, formally into the literature and looked through the literature to say, where has this been done and when? And we also looked for reports. So, a lot of this information, like I mentioned in the very beginning, people were just removing invasive species from islands because they saw they were a problem. It wasn't something that was necessarily, a systemic operation that people were doing all over. And so a lot of the knowledge is held up, in people's memories or in boxes somewhere if it was part of more formal projects, before the internet. So finding this information about what works and what doesn't, where it's done, was not really necessarily available. And so that's why we, had to talk to so many people, ask them for their knowledge, and we're very, very thankful to all the people around the world that were able to take their time freely and share what they had done so that we can actually collate all this information into one place and then look at it and say, okay, so what do we have here? And what we found was over 100 years of activity happening around the world on almost 1,000 islands. I think it was something over 1,500 different attempts to eradicate invasive species. This is a lot, it was a lot more of a normalized activity than I think anyone really realized until we pulled this thing together. And so we were really hoping that with this kind of knowledge of that this is not a new thing, invasive species on islands, it's a problem. Taking invasive species off of islands, we can do it. People have been doing it for a really, really long time. And that's really what this paper is about.
So Dave, let's shift to you and your expertise. So as you kind of hinted in your introduction and explaining your story, you're more of the tech guy. So how did this database come to be, this DICE, the Database of Islands and Invasive Species Eradications? Just like you said, Dena, it is definitely a mouthful, but it's very descriptive, which is perfect because all of us in science like descriptions. So Dave, could you tell us more about the database and how did you help create it? And is there anything else like it out there?
Yeah, thanks. Dena touched on this a little bit, but I guess, for my story, I was really early days at Island Conservation involved in actually implementing these interventions out in the field and was spending most of my time actually out on islands doing projects. But in the rare occasions that I was back in the office in Santa Cruz, there was this kind of collection of data that had been started by one of our founders, Bernie Tershi. Like Dena talked about, that there were, in the early 2000s, there's kind of this was really taking off. There was more and more people doing these kinds of things. It was getting, the results were being published, how these projects were being implemented were being published. And there was a real interest in saying, we need to be tracking this. Like, this is a tool with a binary outcome. Either you are successful or you're not successful. The invasive species is gone or it's not. And you can see gains from that. So we need to start tracking that information. And so it was started by, Bernie and Brad Kitt and others going around to conferences and writing notes on napkins and putting those and collating them all into a spreadsheet. And then someone else designed a really complicated database structure to organize all those things that was really hard to update. So one of my first tasks was kind of organizing the data so that it could be easily updated in Microsoft Access, building a front end so that people could, actually enter data into it. And there's a couple of really key things that Dena touched on. And one was adding a field to verify how accurate the information was. So again, a lot of these things were just kind of from conferences or from conversations, someone saying, oh, I did this eradication on this island, but we needed to have proof either from peer literature or reports just saying, can we verify this information or can we not verify the information? So that was one of the key things of being able to verify, and then also adding in references so that we could say these are the events that we can really stand as being accurate or not. And as Dena mentioned, once we had a database internal we could add information into, the other key piece was identifying what islands you're actually talking about. Someone can say Green Island or Rat Island. There are hundreds of each of those, even multiple in the same country. And so a big portion of this was working with the UN Environmental Program, World Conservation Monitoring Center. They had a global island database product, which shows, a location of an island, a polygon of it, a unique ID. So a huge part of what we did in the beginning was actually verifying what islands are we talking about, and reaching back out to the experts to say, when you're talking about this island, is this the place you're actually talking about, so that we could, again, really verify all these kinds of information. And as we went through the peer review process and reaching out to experts, we were able to verify all of this. And then we worked with the UC Santa Cruz to build a public interface, which you can now see online at dice.islandconservation.org, where people can search and filter from a variety of different things to understand, where these events occurred, what kinds of species have they targeted, what are the outcomes of those different species. And a really important piece is the ability to download that information. And I think as that website and that database came out, we saw more and more practitioners using the tool for a variety of different ways of being able to say, this is the success rate of the tool, and using it to help, not necessarily justify, but help build the support and enabling conditions for doing these interventions of, look, this is a remarkably successful thing. It's being done around the world. We can do it here too. And so it's not only been a tool for tracking it, but it's been a tool to help countries and territories, local communities say, yes, we can do this too, because look, we can stand on the shoulders of others. And I think, the database in the paper, that's a really important piece, is just saying it is the community coming together to say, look, we can have this remarkable, binary outcome of success with really remarkable gains, and we all can do it too. And I think that's the true power of this paper and database.
So it sounds like this is really a revolutionary database that you were able to put together then. Like, does anything else like it exist? Like, was this like a first thing like this, or do you know of any similar things out there?
As far as other databases that track conservation interventions as clearly as this, I'm not aware of any other databases that have quite the same sort of track record. And hopefully this is the kind of thing that other conservation interventions can try and replicate, of, if there are clear outcomes, how can we track the global impact of local action? And I think that is a real novel application that was developed here.
Yeah, it's so pioneer. And also, I love that you just mentioned something that I think is so powerful, is that it sounds like it's pretty much open access. So people who are studying, maybe they have a different scientific question, then they can go into this and answer it because you've done all of this amazing work and put it together. That is so powerful from a community standpoint. Any of us, I was clicking around on it. It is really cool. I was like, oh, that's goat. Oh, that's rats. Oh, that was the multiple things. And and then it also has the success rate or not. And so I thought it's just a very powerful tool. It's simple and easy to use and just very aesthetically pleasing too, because I've come to find that sometimes that part gets missed, but it's very nice to click through.
It is fun. And it is, when I think about other sectors. So if you look in the human health field, or you look in the engineering field, there are oodles of examples of where solutions, if you like, or actions are tracked, and you can evaluate the different success rates. And probably we've done that really well in human health to understand, okay, well, this kind of surgery or this kind of treatment or these kinds of things have different kinds of success rates. And you can see we can get a really nuanced view with those kinds of things as well. Like, well, people with these kinds of conditions or people with this kind of background will have this kind of outcome. And so in the conservation field, there really aren't that many products out there like this. You can see things like the IUCN Red List, really important, but that tracks something different. It tracks sort of conservation status. When you look at things like, there's the protected area management database. If you go to the IUCN, you can see all the protected areas in the world. Fantastic resource. But it doesn't necessarily tell you the outcome of those protected areas. And so this tool goes a little bit further, and it lends itself to that, because as Dave pointed out, there is an outcome we can track. Dena is a very, very clever person, and she's leading another example of where a solution is afoot as it relates to seabird restoration. So watch this space, because I think there'll be another exciting development that I'm sure you want to invite Dena back to talk about sometime soon.
Oh yeah, Dina. We're definitely gonna get to that in like the future application. So for sure, like you like drop that little hint. It's like, oh, stay tuned because we're not done yet. So that was awesome. Oh, thanks so much for that, Nick. So Dave, let's shift back to you for a second. So I want to explore if we could almost boil the database down to a single point, just like you said a moment ago, what you used to do, or you also do, not used to, also do. When you're not in the office working on this database and actually collecting the data, you were in the field going through and doing these interventions, these eradications. So could you explain what that is? Like, what is this intervention, these eradications? And maybe do you even have an example that you've organized? Like, what was involved? Like, could you take me with you to an island and walk me through what do you do to restore one of these? How do you get one of these projects off the ground?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's a huge amount of work that goes into all of these intervention projects, and it's really starting by kind of understanding what do you stand to gain from doing these interventions. And so the starting point is always what is the benefit? What are the species, the habitat you're trying to protect, the ecosystem services? How does the community, and stakeholders use that island? And for island conservation's perspective or others, there's oftentimes communities and stakeholders coming to the conclusion that we need to do something about this particular island. This invasive species that has been introduced, say rats, on Desecheo National Wildlife Refuge in Puerto Rico, was one of the projects that I had managed. Desecheo was one of the Caribbean's largest seabird colonies. There used to be descriptions, again, like Nick was saying, back in the sailing days, of clouds of birds over Desecheo. And then from a series of introductions of invasive species, of goats and rats and other invasive species, those birds slowly declined to the point where there was a very small number of birds there. And so really impactful for over the course of the life history of that island. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, one of the managers of the refuge, realized that something needed to be done to be able to restore that particular island. And going through the process of understanding what are the species that are there, what are their distributions, so you can understand how we're going to actually remove those invasive species. And so when we're talking about rats, there's a series of principles that we apply for eradications. Of you want to make sure that you are addressing the problem, you're removing all of the invasive species on the island, and that you are understanding the kinds of consequences of the actions that you can have, both positive and negative. You want to make sure that if you're removing the invasive species, that invasive plants or other species that you don't want to come back aren't going to come back. And from an eradication perspective, there's a series of tools that we have to be able to remove invasive species. We go into that in the paper, that there's toxicant-based approaches, so using conservation toxicants to be able to remove particularly rodents, or there's manual removal methods, hunting and trapping, and those sorts of methods to be able to remove invasive species from islands. And again, as part of these processes, it's going through and understanding, okay, we're going to be doing this intervention. What are the short-term and long-term consequences of doing that? And so there's a lot of studies beforehand of, okay, if we're going to use a conservation bait, what are the potential impacts of that from a short term? How is that going to affect the ecosystem and the species that are on there? And there's a huge amount of risk mitigation to understand the potential short-term consequences of that. And all of this comes down to, again, from land managers and from stakeholders, of long-term versus short-term gain. Of there may be short-term consequences from using some of these eradication methods on islands, but those short-term consequences are outweighed by the long-term benefits of seeing clouds of seabirds come back to Desecheo National Wildlife Refuge, or islands in the Aleutians in Alaska, where there's a clear difference. You can land on shore and instantly know whether there's rats there or not, because on rat-infested islands, it's virtually silent. There is no bird sound. You get on there and it's just echoing landscape. You go to the next island over that's been rat-free, and it's just a cacophony of sound. As soon as you hit the island, you're just hit with all of these big sounds and you know that there's species there. And there's a very clear difference between those two things. And those are the kinds of outcomes and benefits that we're looking for, and working with communities to be able to make those decisions. And I think it's really important to know that choosing to not do an intervention on these islands is a decision in and of itself, because we know the consequences of that. We know that if those islands will remain silent, they will remain without seabird sounds if we do not do an intervention. Or we know that these species that have been introduced to islands will cause extinctions. And that may be a choice that has to be made for a variety of different reasons, but we know that that's an outcome. And so all of these things are they are all management decisions. And, at the end of the day, these projects are trying to correct the mistakes of the past that Nick talked about, of these intentional or unintentional introductions, and how can we right those wrongs where it makes sense. And we know that the current tools that we have to do this, we can't do all of the interventions that we want to do. I think we did an analysis, another paper that looked at, with our current tool set, we can only do about 15% of the eradications around eradications around the world that we would want to do. And that to really achieve the kinds of gains that we could have, we need a new toolbox. We need tools that are species specific, or new ways of detecting incursions before they get onto an island. We need, communities of practice to be able to do these things so that they're more cost effective and that communities can be involved, and you don't need international expertise flying from somewhere else to help get these off the ground. And the future is there and it's being built, and which is a really exciting thing. And an important output of this paper and this exercise has shown that in 100 years, we've come a really long ways from really early interventions that were done by single individuals to groups of people. And now we have new tools on the horizon that could make these things even more scalable into the future to see really, really remarkable things.
Yeah, and kind of what you've been hinting at, and something that I would love to discuss a little bit further, it's almost like a conservation triage. It's like nobody wants to go to these islands and necessarily do this specific type of work. And so could you maybe share, because sometimes there's people that have opinions or ideas, or maybe not quite understand what's going on, but have you received some negative flack essentially for doing these types of things? And how do you work through that? If someone might be going through, is like, how in the world are you doing this? Why are you doing this? Like, is there a better way? Have you received anything like that or anything? And if you have, like, how do you respond? Like, what's your normal way if someone's asking or questioning what you do or what you did in this particular case?
Yeah, I mean, I think, all of the projects that have happened around the globe have all had some level of concern or trying to understand, why are these projects being done? But I think that is really the important part, is it's about a values-based decision of why are we doing these kinds of interventions. There are these invasive species that have been that are on islands and they're existing, and we know that they're disrupting the ecosystem, and we know that they're causing extinctions, and you can make the decision to have that continue, or you can make the decision of the tools that we have that are currently available, the risks that those tools present, and potential short-term consequences of those tools. Can we outweigh all of those different pieces? And I think it's an interesting question, because again, this is a global tool, and each community, each country has to deal with those in different ways. Within the US, there is a regulatory system and environmental compliance that has public consultation, particularly if it's on US federal lands, that has to go through that process. It involves community engagement and community meetings and a variety of different options, including the option to not proceed with the project, that all those have to be weighed in a very public process. And in other countries, it's not so. It's much more up to individual land managers. But I think it is that focus on what do you stand to gain by doing these interventions and what do you stand to lose. And ultimately, all of these projects come down to feasibility and social acceptability. These projects will not move forward unless a broad consensus that it is an acceptable thing to move forward with. And that doesn't mean that there's not opposition. At best, you can hope that the majority of people are saying we can live with these short-term. We want the long-term gains, and we can live with the short-term impacts.
Yeah, because I really wanted to take a moment to talk about that. Since I work more in the predator space, there's always so much controversy. And like I can feel that some like an intervention like this could also stir up a lot of emotions, a lot of feelings, and like how do you navigate that? And so no, that was a perfect answer. That was beautiful. It's like it's at the end of the day, we all have to come together and make the right decision, whatever that right means. It is different from place to place. You know, Madagascar might feel like it's so different for there than somewhere in like, you know, the Cayman Islands or something. Like those are very different cultures, different stakeholders, different everything. So just because we're talking about one global database, yeah, these are each different places, and whatever happened was not just Island Conservation, Nature Conservancy, or Pacific Rim. It wasn't just you three coming in, this is what we're doing. Like I just really want an opportunity to talk about that. Like this is a group effort. Every single time one of these data points is entered into this database, it's not just that. It's a whole sweep of things that went into that. So thanks again for really explaining that with me. So Dena, let's move towards you for a second. So first, there are some very amazing statistics that you guys came out of this paper, which first we haven't had a chance to say yet. So if you could please just say like, boom, 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 these are the amazing things that we discovered. And then after that, could you dive into kind of what Nick alluded to? What is the application of this? So like we found these things. This is like undeniable science truth. We found these things. And then how do we take this and move forward? What's the application of this information?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks for asking it. You know, to tie into what Dave was saying, something that our paper was looking into was not just, you know, where have these things been done, but like what kind of islands, you know, how big are they? Are they big, small? Do they have people? Are there threatened species on them or not? And so what we did end up seeing is that over time there was this huge increase in the number of invasive species eradications from islands, especially since the 1980s, when certain technologies kind of helped us be able to do a better job of removing invasives. But that was mostly done on smallish islands that were uninhabited, kind of easy-ish enough to get out there, do the job, and leave and watch, you know, biodiversity respond on its own. But what we saw was over time, and specifically in this last decade, that rate of invasive species eradications has actually declined. And instead, what we're seeing is an increase of projects on bigger islands. And bigger islands tend to have human communities on them. They also have more biodiversity on them. So arguably, you know, practitioners are starting to work on harder islands. It takes longer to plan and evaluate, be thoughtful. You know, local communities must be involved. Funding, you know, needs to come from various different places. So these are just harder projects that people are attempting to do. And they're attempting to do them because they saw so much success prior. And, you know, we're hoping that this paper, it helps people understand that, again, like this is something that's been done for over 100 years with over 1,500 different examples of it happening. And now we're seeing it more and more on islands with people where there's actually a benefit beyond just biodiversity. You know, rats carry diseases. And so removing rats from islands can actually stop those diseases from being spread. There's actually been examples looking at, you know, islands with and without rats, where they've been removed or not from, you know, islands with people or not. And we actually see diseases like toxoplasmosis. We see that on islands with people and rats. And when those rats are gone, and same with cats, then we see those diseases going away. And there's a lot of examples of that. So that's a really important aspect of why you might want to remove invasive species from islands where there are human communities. Another important aspect of that is agriculture or even fishing. Invasive species can have a negative effect on agricultural systems. And, you know, we see that on continents too. That's not alone to just islands, but the effect is really great when people depend on their land and on their sea, you know, to eat and to survive and thrive. And so by working together with communities and working on these, you know, bigger islands and inhabited islands, we're actually seeing a much greater benefit, not just to, you know, the plants and animals that we love, but like to our, you know, human communities as well.
And then to continue down a little further, like I said, Nick kind of alluded to something that you might be working on as well. So how are you applying this? Like already, you just published this paper. I mean, literally it just came out like this, woo, fireworks, boo, boo, boo. It just came out and you're already using it to apply to the future. So what could you share with us maybe about what you're up to and how this is already being taken a step further already from what you guys just released?
Yeah, definitely. I know. I appreciated that he put in that plug for this part of the conversation because, the database that we developed for this paper, it really was monumental in that it was so difficult to track conservation efforts and their outcomes. There's a lot of other, stats out there that are easy to track, like baseball stats or
Right.
Nick has talked about Kelley Blue Book. People have been consolidating information to one place to be able to make decisions for a variety of different reasons. But in conservation, there are a lot of problems and there's very limited funding. And it's just really hard for people to put their money into, let's develop a database that then can tell us about what happened in the past. And let's use that to inform our decisions in the future. We're wanting to get boots on the ground and actually do the work to prevent extinctions and to restore ecosystems. So it's not so easy to track these things. And so just having had the opportunity to do that for invasive species eradications and track those efforts over time has been really, really important for, island biodiversity. But the other thing that came out of it was just the actual tool and the method for developing these databases and recognizing that. I'm now with Pacific Rim Conservation, which I mentioned earlier in Hawaii. We're working with the Nature Conservancy and a variety of other groups that are interested in we already actually have done this, but basically taking the methods that we did for this database and asking it for a totally different question, which was reintroduction efforts. I mentioned that I studied seabirds for a long time. I love that group of birds, and this group of people are experts in restoring seabird communities in particular. So, what we've done is said, okay, let's take this and let's ask, where have seabirds been reintroduced to islands and mainland areas over time? How have they been moved? Has it worked? Has it not worked? So we developed the Seaward restoration database really based off of this invasive species eradication database. Our collaborators are in New Zealand as well as in the US, and we actually have already put all this data together. We've reached out to hundreds of people to gather information about where seabirds have been translocated or attracted back into restoration sites. We also asked questions like, were invasive species removed prior? So the work that was done with this invasive species database is actually playing into us being able to understand, what kind of management actions are taking place and what can we restore thereafter. And in this case, we're thinking about seabirds. We have the data already up online at seabirddatabase.org, and we are writing up a paper kind of similar to the one that we did for the DICE, so that we can help seabird practitioners in particular be able to make decisions about where seabirds can be restored effectively, what works and what doesn't. So yeah, it's really exciting. And even from this project, I'm thinking, well, where else can this be applied? And especially in this sort of restoration reintroduction framework. There are a lot of species out there that kind of need a helping hand. Even if in some cases when invasive species, for example, are eradicated from islands, we know that native biodiversity can come back on its own. But given that there's a ton of other stressors out there, including climate change, hunting, for seabirds, there's issues with fisheries, bycatch, animals often need a little bit more these days. And so by, being able to reintroduce them to places that they've become extirpated is a really important, really successful tool. So, we're hoping to take what we've learned now about seabirds and, hopefully one day can do that for other taxa too.
And you completely just answered my other question, which was, what do you do when eradications aren't enough? And you just answered that. You help the things come back. So you might get rid of everything, but sometimes nature does need a helping hand in identifying that. And so now you have a whole database that you're working on, which is amazing. Like, okay, yes, we have this platform foundation. Now what's the next level? Because sometimes, we just gotta give a little nudge, and then hopefully they can come back. So that's fantastic. And of course, when that's out, you're gonna have to come back on and tell me all the things, and we're gonna have to go through that. Yes, and dive deep into that. So Nick, I would love to take this back to you and let's go full circle here. So we've talked about what we do, how to get rid of everything and eradicate everything and try to restore it, as Dena just said, back to its pristine pre-human mess upness. So how do we prevent this from happening over and over and over again?
Good question, because we can remove these harmful invasive species, but how do we stop them coming back again? The mechanisms by their arrival may still be present, and so we need to deal with that. I want to call out something that you just said, though, is you referenced the goal. What are we striving for? And Dena did a great job pointing to who's our audience, who are we communicating to with these kinds of science products. And when I think about that, it's organizations like Island Conservation, Pacific Rim, TNC, a host of others in the NGO space. And it's also about to decision makers, both at local levels that may have responsibilities for islands, but also at national scales as well. And each of these different organizations may have different concepts of what they're striving for. And in some cases, it may not be achievable, especially when we look down the barrel of climate change, to imagine that we could recreate the past. And so there's a particularly challenging, exciting, daunting future where we have to think about what is the right way to create resilience for our islands, for the people that are dependent on islands, and the species and the ecosystems that are dependent on islands. And so we kind of have to flip the paradigm and be willing to be brave when we think about the future. What can we build that's likely going to persist into the future? And a really big part of that touches on thinking about the islands and the solutions and the actions for islands in a holistic sense. And this comes right back to biosecurity, which is a key part of what you're alluding to, which is the prevention of new invasive species coming onto an island. And removing an invasive mammal like a rat can only be done if there is a high degree of confidence that you can control or greatly limit new arrivals of that same species. And as we talked about earlier, our world is changing radically. We're becoming far more increasingly globalized. There's lots more touchstones from different places around the planet to islands. And each one of those touchstones you can think about as a vector, a pathway for not just ourselves or our goods or our services to be transported, but also uninvited guests. And what are the harm those uninvited guests can have? One of the most terrifying and remarkable stories is the brown tree snake in Guam, which was a leftover uninvited guest to the island of Guam. People didn't even really know about it. And all of a sudden, again, it comes back to sound. I like that sound's a major feature of our discussion. They started to notice things were missing in the forest, the sounds. Birds started to disappear. And then all of a sudden, there were extinctions. And we still have the brown tree snake on Guam. We still do not have the capacity to remove this key threat to the ecosystems of Guam. It's still there. And we have the added burden. Guess where Guam's connected to? It's connected to Hawaii. It's connected to Palau. It's connected to all these other places that if the brown tree snake got there, it will have equally devastating consequences. And now we have to think about ants, with these crazy ants that are being moved around the Pacific. They bite people. They're really annoying. They'll reduce the capacity, the value of a tourism product in some of these island nations, in addition to outcompeting and predating native invertebrates. So we really have something else to lose here. And the threats are increasing because of this globalization. And so we have to be really, really vigilant with biosecurity. And so there's a reason when you go to New Zealand, you get off the plane, they don't ask you if you've been to North Korea or Iran. They want to say, have you been camping? Can I see the soles of your boots? And I'm not from New Zealand, but I go through New Zealand regularly on my way home to see family and whatnot. And they do it. They will check everything within an inch of its life because the risk of bacteria or fungi or invertebrates coming in on those boots into the country is potentially economically incredibly damaging. And you see the same thing when you go to Australia as well. And when we think about our little islands as well, here in California, the Channel Islands, or when you go to Auckland, you go out into the Hauraki Gulf, you see Rangitoto or Motu Tapu and these kinds of places, really strict biosecurity. And we want to know, do you have seeds trapped in the Velcro of your jacket? Have you run your hands through the bottom of the pockets of your pack? Are you really confident that you don't have a rat in the back of your car that's going onto the ferry? And so on and so on and so on. So biosecurity is the prevention of new invasive species being transported to our islands. And other key part of this is detection and then rapid response. We want to be able to detect those things and rapidly respond to get rid of them, because in many cases, like the brown tree snake, for example, we don't have the capacity to deal with that if it reaches above a certain level. And so detection and rapid response is key. And that's why some of the most fantastic workers in the biosecurity space, you see conservation dogs, which have their sense of smell as like 8 times the capacity of a human or things like this. And of course, they're rewarded a lot more easily than humans. And so you can get some really willing workers in that space. It's fantastic. So biosecurity is sort of a component of this full spectrum of activity that needs to go on as we think about invasive species. So eradications are often thought of as like a foundational intervention. You can't do a lot of these other things unless you deal with this primary threat. Everything else is kind of fruitless, or you only get sort of minor gains, or you may end up just banging your head against the wall. So you really got to deal with this primary threat of invasives. Once you have dealt with that, with things like eradication of invasive mammals, that enables these other conservation activities to occur. Returning lost seabird populations, maybe bringing in a new animal or plant that, as we look down the barrel of climate change, this is the best opportunity for it to persist into the future. And we need to have biosecurity, sort of this ongoing thing to protect these investments, to protect these places to last into the future. And the best way to think about that is in a return on investment capacity. It's the same as staying healthy. As much as I try and tell my kids, look, those bags of chips are rubbish and that chocolate bar is not going to do you any good, let's think about human health. That doesn't resonate with them, but it's the truth. It's cheaper and it's easier to simply do these low tempo, low cost activities to stay healthy. And that's what we need to think about with our islands. Low tempo, low cost. Because frankly, if these islands get some of these nasties, the invasive, harmful invasive species, we may not have the capacity to deal with them. Or if we do, it may be that, look, it's not a priority until 10 years from now. And that's when something really dramatic and really bad can happen. So there's biosecurity is key, and I think that's a great opportunity to think about these interventions, these eradications of invasive mammals as how does it fit into the spectrum of other restoration activities that are needed in order to see these goals that might be at a local scale or at a national scale, and they will reflect different values, like Dave alluded to, where human health is going to be folded into these. And we can think about economic livelihoods because we're seeing more of these islands in places with people, and so on and so on. So these different value systems are going to lend themselves to the goals. They're going to drive the goals. And we need to think about the solutions in this full spectrum of restoration activities that are out there.
And I love that you just brought up the example of the moment like you land in New Zealand and they're asking about your camping boots, because I've been to the Galapagos Islands and I work in the tourism sector. So explaining what someone is going to experience when they land on that island, and every single item that they have is going to be searched. And it does feel pretty invasive, that's the topic of today, invasive into like your private space. But when someone understands what they're actually doing, they're looking for those nuts. They are looking for something that might be detrimental to this, like as close to pristine, as we know, they're not like 100% pristine, but close to pristine areas. How important it is that there is this checkpoint that is just going to make sure that these islands, that pretty much the only industry there is tourism. I have a lot of friends there that are guides and just, boat owners and stuff. Like when COVID happened, they were absolutely devastated. Now just imagine if something was accidentally brought in. that wiped out one of the most amazing places that's one for tourists and then also for biodiversity. And that one checkpoint is hoping, I mean, us in the tourism industry, we do our best to try to prepare tourists and like, please do not bring these items. And there's always that person like, oh, they're not going to find it. They're not going to check. They will find it and they will check and they will take it, but it's all for the greater good of the wildlife that you're there to see. And so just keeping that in perspective when you are going through some things like that, like it's a biosecurity thing. It's has nothing to do with you as a person. It's like, this is to make sure that our islands stay here.
Yeah. And it's a fantastic way for any visitor, a tourist, a scientist, to actively participate in conservation. When we worked on Macquarie Island, for example, there's native brassica down there, fantastic mega herbs. You're in these. So you're down in the Southern Antarctic, it's crazy windy. The Southern Ocean is just screaming through the roaring 40s, the furious 50s. And they're called mega herbs. And some of them belong to the brassica family. And you duck down underneath them and the wind disappears. It's like you're in like a hobbit tunnel or something. It's fantastic. But a consequence of that is no cauliflower or broccoli is taken to the island as a food item because of the potential for disease transfer. And so that even like at that sort of thoughtful level, and an island that belongs to the US National Wildlife Refuge System and to the Nature Conservancy that I visit every now and then, we freeze all of our belongings for 48 hours once we arrive on the island in order to eliminate the likelihood that ants, for example, or seeds have opportunity to persist. And when we used to go down to the Antarctic, when we moved between locations, we would wash our boots in sort of a mix of bleach and water in order to, not only to get rid of all the penguin poop on our boots, but to eliminate the idea that we might transport disease from one colony to another as we moved around there. And so it's kind of, that stuff's fun. Like that's yes. People actively participating in conservation. So not only is it a responsibility, but man, it's an opportunity to do cool stuff. I'm like, oh, why do I have to do this? Oh, wow, yeah, of course, yeah, I'm going to do this.
Yeah. So like the moment you land, you're already getting like a conservation lesson. It's like, this is what we're doing and this is why. Yeah. And then to expand on that, since you work with so many different islands and groups and stuff, is there a nation or a region that is like setting the standard of this? Who is like the leading body or entity in restoring islands, or who can we look to set the way?
That's a good question. And we did see some of those results in the paper. This was an opportunity to sort of see some outcomes. And, I know Mexico is a superb example. And you can see that all the way up at a national level. Mexico has a national island strategy. And this is remarkable because Mexico is not an island nation. Another great body of work has been done by the Seychelles, where they are an island nation, so they obviously think islands in just about everything they do. Not only have they done this foundational activity a lot of times for their offshore islets, they've also done so much in sort of building more resilient islands by moving species back into these spaces, revegetation work, tackling some of the plant weeds, things like this. So countries like the Seychelles and countries like Mexico, we have to talk about New Zealand because a lot of the tools, especially this tool, the focus of this paper, originated in New Zealand. The development of these tools and the testing and the trialing and the piloting and these kinds of things evolved in New Zealand. And so we've got our New Zealand colleagues who are on the paper, like James Russell and these they do a good job, healthy job of reminding us of the importance of New Zealand's contribution to this space.
That's awesome.
And what I will say is it also highlighted for us opportunities where some countries have an enormous wealth, not in a financial sense, but a wealth in islands that they are responsible for. And the US has islands in, believe it or not, the Southern Hemisphere and way out in the Western Pacific, north up in the Arctic, the Caribbean, islands all over the place in an incredible array of latitudes and ecosystems and species diversity. Yet they are doing things in the island space but there is so much more opportunity to be done there. And so when we look at this paper, another thing we see, wow, places like Mexico, that's sort of gold standard. But we also see, hey, wow, the US, there's opportunity here to do so much more and benefit islands and communities at a scale that would be quite remarkable on the global stage. So I don't have a US accent, so I'm always cautious about how I say this, so maybe Dave or Dena should. But the US has a long way to go.
No, I'm glad. And thank you for being honest with that, because sometimes, even though the show is based in the US, it is a very global international community. And so like highlighting places that all of us should start looking towards, like who is the correct player in this? Where should we focus our attention and start emulating what they're doing or looking more into what they're doing? And yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised that the US isn't the top of the line there with everything else that's going on right now. So I mean, it's good that somebody's leading the charge.
Well, the US has also done some really remarkable things as well. We talked about the Channel Islands. The Channel Islands has this bird behind me that is the island scrubjay, and it's endemic to the island of Santa Cruz in the Channel Islands. Channel Islands are 8 islands. And the Channel Islands used to have a history of ranching. And so, then there was this big renaissance in conservation. One of the first actions was sort of transfer of ownership to national parks and other land management agencies, including the Nature Conservancy. And these ungulates, which were non-native, came off the islands. So we got sheep, cattle, horses, goats. They came off the islands. And not surprisingly, vegetation recovered. And so birds like this have benefited because of the oak and the ceanothus and all these remarkable things that the scrubjay is dependent on, because they removed an unwanted engineer, if you like. Ungulates and rats are very much the same. By removing these invasive species, you can see this transform. Nature can transform itself and bring itself back in a way. So the US has done really remarkable things, and probably one of the best measures if you look at the US's own Endangered Species Act. So this is the US's equivalent of the Red List. It's a yardstick of who is closest to extinction, and we've seen animals and plants come off the SA Red List, and eradication of invasive species on islands has contributed to that outcome. In the Channel Islands, there's something called a night lizard, and it's this really awesome, craggly Game of Thrones looking thing, but it's about your navy.
Awesome.
And by getting rid of goats and by allowing habitat to recover, it's allowed the range to expand in a way that land managers and the powers that be don't feel as worried about it going extinct anymore, and it came off the red list. So I have kids, and so I'm not going to tell them, you're doing a terrible job, you really need to do better. It's more about, well done, you've done some good things, now let's look to the future. I think that's the approach for the US.
Yes.
Yeah. I think there are other stories too that, Nick talked about the Channel Islands. One of the ones that stands out for me, and you mentioned the Galapagos earlier, was there's a couple of projects that Island Conservation and the Galapagos National Park did to restore some of those island ecosystems. So there was Pinzone Island, there was the Pinzone tortoise, which only lives on that particular island, that because rats were introduced, was not breeding on the island anymore and hadn't been breeding for quite a long time. And it was actually the Galapagos National Park that was going out to the island, collecting eggs, collecting young tortoises, and bringing them back to another island so that they could be reared till they were big enough where rats wouldn't be impacting them. And, they basically had to be above a certain size at which they wouldn't be impacted by rats anymore. And so we did an intervention to remove invasive rats from the island. And then within a couple of years, Dena, I think you were involved in this, and a few others went back to the island and saw tortoises hatching and on the island for the first time in, decades. And so those are the kinds of gains that you can see. A similar project in the Galapagos on Rabida Island, there was a species of gecko that had only been described in fossil records by the California Academy of Sciences and wasn't even known to exist. Similarly, rodents were removed from that island. And 2 years later, I was with the park rangers on the island surveying whether we were successful or not. And one of the park rangers reached down and grabbed one of these gecko species by hand.
Oh my gosh.
It was the first time it had ever been, it didn't even know it existed. And now there's a species of gecko that was only in fossil record that had been captured live that no one knew it was there. And so these are the kinds of really remarkable surprises and gains you can see by doing these interventions. And that's just on the species level. But if you think about the vegetation recovery, or how increased seabirds can have nutrients to go into coral reefs, into fish biomass, there's all this whole ecosystem restoration that you can speak to. And Dena, I mean, you were involved in those Galapagos projects. I don't know if you want to add any more to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, we live for this stuff, right? Like, we're not in it because we want to remove invasive species or talk about invasive species in it at all. You know, it's more about what can happen once we do these things. The story of this gecko is just unbelievable. I mean, hadn't even been, I think it was known from the fossil record. And it's just this simple action of taking away something that's, you know, predating on the island, that all of a sudden it's gone and you rediscover species you thought were extinct. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. But yeah, I led a field crew out to Pinzon and Rabbit Island back in 2014 to monitor response of biodiversity after the rats were removed from those islands. And actually, while we were out there, the group that does Galapagos tortoise captive rearing, because rats are gone, they're able to, you know, take them from those areas and put them back onto these islands. And so we actually got to see people like hiking tortoises up into this island, like in backpacks.
I've seen pictures of that. That's amazing.
It's amazing. Yeah, I mean, these you know, captive breeding programs are absolutely crucial for, you know, holding on to species that are near to extinct. But we have to do something on these islands. And so what the Galapagos story is just so amazing, because we actually were able to say, okay, you know, this super endangered tortoise can go back there now. And not only that, but, you know, while we were there, we saw evidence of hatchlings. You know, these tortoises that were brought back from these captive breeding programs were breeding. And it's an amazing response to, you know, and we're just hoping that, you know, over time that these tortoises will actually live out their days there. For, you know, these animals live 100 years or so, you know. I mean, they're pretty incredible, as are, you know, a lot of the other, you know, unique Galapagos wildlife that everyone hears about them. And we think about the Galapagos as this, you know, pristine, we like to say that area, but, you know, invasive species had a huge impact on native biodiversity in that region, and we're hoping to reverse that.
And they're definitely, coming back to like who to watch in this space, it's the Galapagos National Park and the communities that live in that space. The trajectory of courage and the trajectory of impact that they've had in a couple of decades to offset this foundational threat of invasive species is amazing to see. And so the Galapagos, oh my God, obviously not just a great place for endemism and the biodiversity and the history, but also because of the conservation, because it is a global model for what can be achieved. And when you can see that in other places, so you can see how the history or the narrative over time that we're able to document in this paper, you can see sort of intuitive directions that it's going. And one of the most conspicuous ones is New Zealand. And so they have set themselves this goal of predator-free New Zealand 2050. And so they would like to see one of Australia's unfortunate gifts, the possum, the brush-tailed possum, completely removed from the entire nation, in addition to stoats and to rats. And that's a huge goal. That's the equivalent of JFK saying we're going to the moon at the end of the century. They don't know how they're going to do it yet, but what it's set in motion with this ambition is new tool development. It's community as a practice. It's building foundations that, again, the rest of the world is sort of benefiting from as this country introspective on how to reach these bigger goals. And you can see similar things else. Australia is striving to tackle feral cats at a national scale because of the impact that these animals have, not just to their offshore islands, but to the nation as a whole. And so you can see really ambitious and remarkable goals being set as it relates to islands. And so again, you know, when you think about ROI, if you're in the business of seeing good things happen on this planet, then islands are an intuitive place to direct your energies, because you can get high return on investment. And so it's definitely a space to watch. all these stories of individual stories on islands that we can tell these all day. Each one of us has so many of these stories. And if your listeners are interested, we did write a paper with have to give her a shout out because she's been so key to all of our endeavours and our thought leadership, is Holly Jones. And Holly helped us pull together all these incidences of, hey, this thing got downlisted, this seabird returned, or hey, this place seemed to grow more lizards, or we pulled all of them together into a single paper as well. So it's a wonderful companion piece because this paper sets out really, I love this paper because it's just so simple. It's like, hey, this tool, it's got an 88% success rate. I'm like, oh, that's pretty good. I get that. And now that we have this companion piece that talks about, well, that was this 88%, that's a means to an end. That's just a path to an outcome. Tell me about the outcome. This other paper talks about the outcome and it says, hey, here's all that, in this case, the animals that have benefited. And it talks about the number of populations. And there were hundreds of populations and dozens of species where we've seen positive outcomes, either because they had the capacity to recover on their own simply by removing this threat, or because it enabled some other action to occur, moving an animal around or something like this, conservation translocations like Dena alluded to earlier. So we'll make sure that that's in your notes.
Yeah, I was going to say, I wrote that down, my show notes, Holly Jones. Okay, we're going to make sure that paper's in there too, because I want to read that as well. Yeah. So,
I mean,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I mean, something, bringing it back to the paper and what we were able to look at was just who was doing these actions. And we've talked a lot about New Zealand and, moving on to these bigger, more ambitious projects. Nick mentioned the Seychelles and Mexico. For them, they've already accomplished, at least Mexico, I know has attempted or finished over half of their islands with invasive species. They've already removed invasive species from those islands. And so their actions are now moving towards these more larger restoration goals. It's not the removal of invasive species that's the end game. It's to restore ecosystems. And a lot of these projects are being done with local communities. And so, we're able to see when different countries started these interventions, what their track record was. And, for places like Mexico, they've done so much that they're now able to move on to the actual seeing biodiversity response across so many of their islands because of the hard work they've done. And the other thing, that got picked up by doing this work is that, but over most of the decades of these actions, 80% of all eradications were done by just 8 different nations: New Zealand, Mexico, Seychelles, US. But what we're seeing now is more and more countries doing the work itself. There's something I think 36 or 38 different countries that we identified that are now doing invasive species eradication. So it's all this hard work that everyone has already done, bringing this all in and sharing that information. It's this knowledge sharing capability that's really, helping us see more and more people in a diverse set of communities and a diverse number of islands now really attempting eradication. So it's really exciting.
And I think that's really important, is that we're really seeing this replication and scaling of these different visions. Again, Nick mentioned the predator-free 2050. The Seychelles and Mexico have reached these points. Palau is starting to explore a vision for what would invasive-free rock islands look like. A group of islands in Canada, the Haida Gwaii, is similarly considering how can we achieve archipelago-wide invasive-free outcomes that would benefit community and the local goals. And Island Conservation and Scripps and Rewild have launched an Island Ocean Connection Challenge to try and restore 40 islands by 2030, and getting the government of Panama and Palau and Chile to sign on to it. And part of that is also this setting the vision, setting the future, and setting the scale to help some of these emerging countries replicate and build the capacity to be able to build their own visions that make sense within those contexts and those communities, and helping them achieve that. So I think there's so many different challenges and visions that are coming out there that are just continuing to build on this momentum that is so well documented in the papers that we've described.
So I think one thing that I want to bring up next, you've all alluded to it and you've briefly touched on it, and that is people's role in this. So pretty much every episode of the Rewildology podcast, we can't talk about wildlife and conservation without talking about people, because those two things are completely intertwined. So Dena, I would like to ask you, in your view, where do local communities fit into this story, and how do they benefit when we do these eradications and restorations? What is there to gain for the people who are affected most by this?
Right. Yeah. It's such an important piece. I mean, we couldn't do these efforts if it wasn't, driven by people. Like, I mean, that's the baseline of all this. And back to Mexico, most of their projects were done with local community members, local NGOs, and government, all working together to be able to actually address these issues. A lot of the islands have fishing communities or permanent inhabitants. And if you're not working with the people that are actually affected on the ground, like you just can't get this work done. And not only is it about the eradication, we talked about biosecurity. You have, in order to do an eradication and have it succeed, you have to make sure the invasive species doesn't come back. And so it's really all about the local community. I mean, nothing else. To say like, yeah, we want to keep our land like this. We want to protect what we've already protected and keep invasive species out. And so I think the more and more islands that are worked on that have people on them, the more this messaging will get across. People see this problem all over the world. It's not confined to just even that number of islands that we've been able to identify. So it's really that kind of bottom up movement of people being interested in being able to use this tool is really, really important, but at the same time, funding is really important. So if people you might want to eradicate invasive species from islands, but if you don't have the money or the capacity to do so, it just won't happen. And so I think that that's another, huge next step is we know what islands have. Well, we actually don't know all the islands that have invasive species. Like that's an important, biogeographic question, but we can estimate it. Nick said we know that approximately 80% of all archipelagos have rats on them. We know that islands with highly threatened species, we know where invasive species occur with them. But in any case, if we don't have the funding to get those projects off the ground, if we don't put the tools into people's hands, these projects can't be done. So it's kind of just a call for, not just, local support, national support, and also international funding where possible to help support these projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think communities really are first and foremost for all of these. I mean, even Island Conservation as a nonprofit, we don't own any islands, and all of these things are done to help support the local projects. And I think a great example of that is Floriana Island back in the Galapagos. There's more than 50, IUCN listed species that occur on an island. There's introduced rats, cats, and mice that are on the island that are impacting all those species. But there's also a community of at least 100 people that live on the island. And a huge part, and it's been almost a decade in planning, is to understand what are the impacts of those invasive species to the biodiversity, but also there's farmers and people that grow food that are impacted by rats. Their food crops that they rely on either to sell or to eat day to day are impacted by rats. And the tourism's, as similarly as you described earlier, of people coming out to the island, they want to see biodiversity, but if you're not seeing the Floriana mockingbird or some of the medium tree finch or some of the other species that are out there, that's highly impactful. And when we talk about implementing these projects from the community perspective, there's whole life changes that they need to make to be able to implement these projects. Things like, how do you store your food waste? How do you go about recycling? Or, how do you responsibly manage your pets so that they don't impact these things? Or what are the impacts to water quality? And so to be able to do all these kinds of projects, there are some very day-to-day behavioral changes that the community needs to buy into to be able to make sure that the project is successful. And so, all of these projects are very largely community driven, especially on islands where people are living there. And it's kind of, again, building the momentum, building the enabling conditions, and getting those short-term versus long-term benefits to be understood so that these things can really move forward.
Yeah, that was awesome. Perfect answer. So, Nick, let's shift to you for a second. So I'm feeling super inspired. You all have just given me so much information. Like, I want to do everything that I possibly can to help in any way, but I don't live on an island. I am literally as far away from the ocean as you can possibly imagine. I'm in the Rocky Mountains, USA. Like, that's not, you don't get further away. So I'm not near an island. I don't make a lot of money where I can't donate a whole bunch of funds. There's like all of these things that I can't do. And maybe a listener might feel the same way. So what can the amazing person listening right now as a community, what can we do to help with this work, to move forward? If we could take away one thing, like what is that?
Great question. And I love questions like these. And I'm sure some of your listeners are going to be, maybe they're early stage career conservationists and scientists. Maybe they're retired and they live by the coast, or who knows? I'm not sure who your listenership are, but I do know that just doing what you're doing right now, becoming educated and opening yourself up to new narratives, to new stories. If islands haven't been a part of that, then I'd encourage you to learn. Just learning is the key. These are the initial sparks that give you the opportunity to understand about our massive world and the opportunities that lie there. Read about islands, whether it's as old as sort of Darwin's cornerstone book that's influenced all of us in ecology and science, or whether it's something a little bit more modern, whether it's a travel story to islands. These are some of the easiest ways to open yourselves up to islands. And we'd be happy to provide, so I'm sure between the three of us, we can throw a few suggested readings out there. And then watch this space. When we look at conservation, and it's not hard to see some of the more inspiring stories and some of the things that give us hope are on islands. Predator-Free New Zealand 2050, the Island Ocean Challenge, there's a Micronesia Challenge 2030, all of these types of big picture, ambitious goals. These are opportunities to see change in our lifetimes. Learn about these and follow them, because I know that it's hard sometimes. We all have it. All four of us probably have it. I'm sure many of your readers do it. You open up the paper, it's like, oh God, one more thing.
Yes.
But islands offer stories of hope. And so I think that's a place where your listeners will enjoy having islands as a part of their regular feature. And if you have the capacity, or if you are living on an island, or you can visit islands, visit islands. These are some of the most amazing places on the planet. And so you can feel things and see things and hear things that you might not otherwise get the opportunities to experience. The cacophony of a seabird colony, the overwhelming smell of a seal harem, and watching rare birds that exist nowhere else in the world fly through your vision. It's just, there's opportunities there. And when you think about island natural history, there's a lot of islands within islands. And so in the US, mountaintops are often islands within islands. And so some of the same principles, some of the same conservation thinking and strategies lend themselves to mountaintops, to freshwater ecosystems, and more. But those are stories for another day.
Yeah. I mean, and I would add that too. I mean, I think the problem of invasive species is a really big one, and it's one that, almost anyone, whether they're on an island or not, can see in their own backyards. If they look at, pay attention to the birds and other animals that are around you, what things might be impacting those species. And, Nick talked earlier about biosecurity. For your listeners, travel with intention. Understand the potential consequences of your actions, not just to islands, but even when you're traveling from state to state. I mean, there's invasive plant species, there's Burmese pythons and pets that have been introduced. There's a whole variety of things that are impactful to all of us every day, no matter where we live. And we all have a responsibility to understand those and do our part to try and stop the spread of those things. Islands is a really great example that really drives home what we stand to lose. But those same things we can stand to lose on continental systems, and continents are the place where we don't have a lot of the tools to do this right now. We might not have them for 50 to 100 more years to address some of these invasions on islands. So the best thing that we can do is prevent them before we need to do the removal. And that's a responsibility that all of us as people that inhabit planet Earth have a responsibility to try and be responsible about that and stop those introductions and invasions.
Yeah, that was absolutely perfect. Well, Dave, Dena, and Nick, I am so honored and so privileged to sit down with you three and share your amazing work. And I cannot wait to get this out and share with the whole community, and then as well as follow up and maybe even have future episodes with all of you or one of you, and just keep us in the know. Obviously, this is a very important space to watch. And so everybody, this is not the first time you're going to hear from these three. But again, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, talk about an amazing conversation with these three incredible scientists, right? If you feel inspired, be sure to check out all of the resources listed in this episode's show notes to see how you can support island conservation, the Nature Conservancy, and Pacific Rim conservation. All right, I know I promised you all a list of everything that we tackle while the show was silent in August. First, though, I want to explain why I decided to slam the brakes and pause releasing episodes for a whole month. To be fully transparent, I felt that I had reached my max capacity with the show and started reaching out, asking for help on how I could take things to the next level. To help me get through this glass ceiling, I got in touch with some amazing podcast gurus that gave me great advice on where to take the show, and I pre-recorded an entire series based on the knowledge that they shared with me. Well, after polling all of you, I learned that most of you don't prefer series/seasons and like the current releasing schedule of random topics every week. So after having created this whole plan, I realized that it wasn't what you wanted. And so I blew it up, took a break, and figured out what to do next. So in the month of August, the podcast grew by 100%. And now I have the wonderful Heather Bailey as part of the Rewildology team to help me with the tech side of the show. Audio, video, sound, YouTube, etc. She and I have so many big visions planned that we'll announce to you all as soon as they're put together. Also, I finally took the time to build an entire resources section on the Rewildology website. In this section, you'll find a recommended reading list, all of the organizations and projects that have been featured on the show, and a huge resource article for anyone else that would like to launch their own nature podcast. I will soon be releasing a solo episode all about conservation travel, and will include tips, tricks, resources, everything that can help you plan your next adventure, and it will be put in this section of the website. Next, all episodes are finally organized by region and topic. So now if you'd like to hear every episode from one part of the world or about, say, marine ecosystems, you can get a snapshot of everything the show has released about your topic of interest. Lastly, there are new ways to support the show. This podcast doesn't have any corporate sponsors. And so now, if you'd like to help fund the podcast and keep these stories on the airwaves, you can make a secure donation to the show through PayPal. While on the website, you can also purchase a piece of swag and show your Rewildology love. As a reminder, at least 10% of anything that this podcast makes will go directly to our conservation partners. And those are all of the updates that I can share with you as of now. I wish I could spill the beans about everything else that we're working on, but I think this is a great place to start. Again, thank you all for being a part of the Rewildology community, and I can't wait to see where the show is in another year and a half. Hey, thanks again for listening to this episode of Rewildology. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe button to never miss a future episode. Do you have a cool environmental organization, travel story, or research that you'd like to share? Let me know at rewildology.com. Until next time, friends, together we will rewild the planet.